The child killer who was executed inside prison. 25 stabs and the hidden prison code. The prison cell was silent. A man who had been sentenced to spend decades behind bars was lying on his bed. At first glance, nothing looked unusual. No alarms, no screams, no signs that anything had happened. But inside that small prison cell at HMP Wakefield, one of Britain's most secure prisons, a brutal act had already taken place. A convicted child killer named Kyle Bevan was dead. He had been stabbed 25 times. And the people responsible were not strangers. They were 3 convicted killers who were already serving time for their own violent crimes. The shocking question was not only how Kyle Bevan died, but why 3 dangerous criminals decided to enter his cell and carry out what looked like an execution. Because inside prison there is another world, a world with its own rules, its own hierarchy, and sometimes its own idea of justice. Kyle Bevan was 33 years old. Before he became a name known across the United Kingdom, he was a man living a relatively ordinary life in Wales. But in 2020, everything changed. A 2-year-old girl named Lola James died after suffering catastrophic injuries. Lola was the daughter of Bevan's partner. The little girl was only 2 years old, a child who should have been protected. Instead, investigators found a horrifying scene. The evidence presented during the trial showed that Lola had suffered severe injuries before her death. The case shocked the public. People across the country struggled to understand how someone could harm such a young child. During the investigation, attention turned toward Kyle Bevan. The prosecution argued that Bevan was responsible for Lola's death. After a trial, he was convicted of murder. The sentence was severe: life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 28 years before he could even be considered for release. For many people, that punishment represented justice. But inside the prison system, Bevan had entered a completely different environment, one where some crimes carried a different level of hatred. HMP Wakefield in West Yorkshire is not an ordinary prison. It holds some of the most dangerous criminals in Britain: murderers, organised crime figures, violent offenders, men who have spent years living in an environment where intimidation and survival matter. And according to prosecutors, Wakefield had another problem. Certain vulnerable prisoners were not always separated from other inmates. This created a dangerous situation, because among prisoners there is often an unofficial hierarchy, and crimes involving children are frequently viewed with extreme hostility. Prosecutors described this as a distorted moral hierarchy, a place where criminals who themselves had committed terrible acts still judged others, and Kyle Bevan was now at the bottom of that hierarchy. In the months before his death, tension inside Wakefield was increasing. There had already been serious violent incidents. The prison atmosphere was described as extremely tense. Then came November 4th. A day that would end with one of the most disturbing prison killings in recent British history. Shortly after 5:30 in the evening, Kyle Bevan returned to his cell. Security cameras captured the movement. 3 prisoners followed him. Their names: Mark Fellows, Lee Newell, and David Taylor. 3 men with violent histories. 3 men who prosecutors said entered Bevan's cell together. What happened inside that room lasted only a few minutes. But those minutes would later become the centre of a murder trial. The camera footage showed something chilling. The 3 men entered the cell. Then the door closed. For almost 5 minutes. Nobody outside knew exactly what was happening. No one could see inside. No one could hear everything that happened. The prosecution argued that Bevan was attacked during this time. He was stabbed repeatedly. The injuries were fatal. At least 2 different weapons were believed to have been used. Then, the 3 men walked out. According to prosecutors, their behaviour appeared calm, almost as if they believed their mission was complete. The contrast was disturbing. A few minutes earlier, Kyle Bevan was alive. Now, inside his own cell, he was dying. The next morning, prison staff received a message from another inmate. Something was wrong with Bevan. When officers entered the cell, they found him lying on the bed, his body positioned almost as if he was sleeping. But he was dead. The reality was much darker. He had died from blood loss after suffering 25 stab wounds. The man who had been convicted of killing a child had now become the victim of another killing. The investigation immediately focused on the 3 prisoners: Mark Fellows, Lee Newell, David Taylor. But investigators faced a difficult problem. The exact actions inside that cell were unclear. Who held the weapon? Who delivered the fatal wounds? Who blocked the door? Who acted as a lookout? The prosecution argued that all three did not need to physically stab Bevan to be guilty. If they helped, if they encouraged, if they participated in any way, they could be responsible. The three defendants remained silent. During police interviews, they did not provide answers. During the trial, they did not give evidence. The jury heard the prosecution's argument. This was not a random attack. This was a planned group killing, a prison execution. But why? Why would three already convicted killers target one man? The answer appeared to come from the hidden culture inside prisons. A culture where some prisoners believe they have their own form of punishment. A place where certain crimes can make someone a target, and where violence becomes a language. The trial would not only examine a prison murder, it would expose something darker, a hidden world inside the walls of HMP Wakefield, a place where criminals created their own rules, and where some believed they had the right to punish others. At the centre of the case were three men, Mark Fellows, Lee Newell, and David Taylor. Each one already had a history of violence. Each one understood the prison environment, and prosecutors believed that was exactly why they were involved. Mark Fellows was not a stranger to the world of serious crime. He was already serving a sentence connected to organised violence. Inside prison, he was considered a dangerous individual. The prosecution argued that Fellows had a strong hatred toward people convicted of crimes against children. A hatred shared by some prisoners who viewed such offenders as the lowest level of criminal. But investigators questioned something important. Was this simply hatred, or was it a planned act of revenge? Lee Newell also had a violent past. During the trial, prosecutors highlighted a disturbing connection. They told the jury about a previous killing connected to Newell, a case where he attacked another prisoner who had harmed a child. The similarity was described as deeply unsettling. In both situations, the victim was connected to crimes against children, and in both cases, the victim was left on a bed, a detail prosecutors described as a frightening pattern. They suggested this was not random violence. It was a repeated behaviour, a message. Then there was David Taylor, a man who, according to the court, had spoken about his ability to create improvised weapons, weapons made from ordinary objects, anything available, anything that could be transformed. After Kyle Bevan's death, improvised weapons were discovered connected to Taylor's cell. However, investigators could not prove those specific items were used in the fatal attack. But for prosecutors, the discovery added another layer to the case. It showed knowledge, experience, an opportunity. The jury heard how Kyle Bevan was not an aggressive prisoner. In fact, he was described as someone who kept to himself. He spent much of his time inside his cell. He often requested to be locked in. He avoided attention. He avoided conflict. But that may have made him easier to isolate. And on the evening of November 4th, he was followed. The CCTV footage became one of the most important pieces of evidence. The cameras did not show what happened inside the cell. They showed only the beginning and the end. 3 men walking in, 3 men walking out, a few minutes between them, a gap filled with questions. The prosecutor, Jason Pitter, KC, told the court that the evidence pointed toward a coordinated attack. The 3 men did not simply happen to be there. They moved together. They entered together. They left together. And after the attack, they appeared calm, almost satisfied. But the defense raised an important point. A person can be present at a crime without committing the crime. The court needed to decide, were they all involved? Or was one person responsible while others were nearby? The judge reminded the jury that they needed to be certain each defendant was at least part of the group. Even if one person held the weapon, another person could still be guilty for helping, for encouraging, for preventing escape, for acting as a guard. The most disturbing detail was how long the attack lasted. Less than 5 minutes. A short amount of time, but enough for a life to end. A man who had once stood in court as an accused murderer was now lying dead in a prison cell. The case also raised questions about the prison system itself, because HMP Wakefield was not dealing with ordinary inmates. These were men convicted of some of the most serious crimes. The question became, should prisoners who commit crimes against children be separated from others for their own protection? Or does that create a different kind of problem? Some argued that the prison system failed to protect a vulnerable inmate. Others pointed out that prisons contain dangerous people, and preventing all violence is extremely difficult. But beyond the legal arguments, there was a disturbing psychological element. The attackers were not acting like people who believed they were innocent. They were already convicted criminals. They already lived with violence. But inside their world, they appeared to believe they were enforcing their own code, a twisted version of justice, a punishment system created by prisoners themselves. The jury eventually reached their decision. After less than 3 hours of discussion, Mark Fellows, Lee Newell, and David Taylor were found guilty of murdering Kyle Bevan, 3 killers, 1 victim, a prison cell, and a question that remains uncomfortable. When someone who has committed a terrible crime is killed by others, is it revenge, justice, or simply another act of violence? The death of Kyle Bevan created a strange and uncomfortable situation. A man convicted of killing a 2-year-old child became the victim of another murder. Many people reacted with anger. Some saw his death as a form of revenge. Others saw something far more disturbing. Because when a prisoner is killed inside a prison, it raises a difficult question. What happens when the people who are supposed to be controlled begin creating their own justice? Inside prisons, violence often follows patterns. It is not always random. There can be unofficial rules, invisible boundaries, a social hierarchy that exists beyond the official prison system. And in that world, certain crimes can make someone a target. Crimes against children are often viewed with extreme hostility among inmates, even among people who have committed serious crimes themselves. This creates a disturbing contradiction. Some criminals who have ignored society's laws still create their own moral code, a code that decides who deserves respect and who does not. Psychologists who study prison environments often describe this as a survival system. In a closed environment where people live under constant pressure, power becomes extremely important. Reputation matters, fear matters, and sometimes violence becomes a way to gain status. For some prisoners, attacking another inmate is not only about revenge. It can also be about identity, about proving something to others, about showing control. In the case of Kyle Bevan, prosecutors believed the attack was not spontaneous. They believed it was planned. The evidence suggested coordination. 3 men moving together, entering the cell together, leaving together. The attack lasted only minutes, but the preparation behind it may have been much longer. The question is not only, who killed Kyle Bevan? The deeper question is, why did they believe they had the right to do it? The court heard that the 3 defendants did not explain themselves. No detailed confession, no public justification, no statement telling the world what happened inside that cell. Only silence. And sometimes silence creates more questions than answers, because without their explanation, people are left to look at the evidence, the footage, the timing, the behavior, the history. The jury eventually reached its conclusion. Mark Fellows, Lee Newell, and David Taylor. All 3 were found guilty of murdering Kyle Bevan. The verdict confirmed what prosecutors had argued. This was not simply a fight. This was a coordinated killing. A prisoner had been targeted, a cell had become a crime scene, and a prison designed to contain violence had become the location of another violent death. But the story does not end with the verdict, because the case exposed a bigger issue. How does a prison protect inmates from each other, especially when those inmates are some of the most dangerous people in society? A prison is supposed to be a place where punishment happens under the control of the law, not a place where prisoners decide punishments themselves. Because once that line disappears, the system becomes something else. There is another uncomfortable question. If a person commits an unforgivable crime, does that change the value of their own life? The law says no. A person can be sentenced. A person can lose their freedom. But the punishment is decided by a court, not by another prisoner, not by a group, not by violence. Kyle Bevan's story began with a tragedy involving a child. It ended with another tragedy behind prison walls. 2 deaths, 2 families destroyed, and a chain of violence that continued long after the first crime. The most chilling detail may not be the number of wounds, not the prison, not even the attackers. It may be the idea that somewhere inside a building built to enforce order, another set of rules existed, a hidden system, a silent code, a world where some prisoners believe they are judges, and where a cell door can separate life from death. Because in the end, This case is not only about one murderer being killed, it is about what happens when violence enters a place that is supposed to contain it. A prison can lock away a person. But can it always control what happens inside? This was the story of Kyle Bevan, the child killer who became the victim, the prisoner who was sentenced by a court and later judged by the people around him. A case where justice, revenge, and violence became impossible to separate.